I'm a 26-year-old guy, and this is the story of how I realized the dream of owning my first home while navigating a mess of parental control and manipulation that I never saw coming. It's been a wild ride, but here's how it all began. Growing up, my parents always had a tight grip on everything. They weren't the type to encourage freedom or independence. In our house, their word was law, and there was no room for debate. If you even dared to push back, the answer was simple: our way or the highway. That was the world I grew up in. Despite all that, I always knew I wanted more for myself. I worked hard in high school and juggled multiple part-time jobs to save for college. When I finally got there, I didn't have the luxury of coasting through. While my friends were spending their weekends partying, I was pulling shifts at the campus dining hall or delivering food late into the night. My parents weren't going to pay for school, so I knew I had to make it happen on my own. After graduation, I kept the hustle going. I took on freelance gigs, picked up overtime whenever I could, and pinched every penny. My goal was clear: I wanted to own a home before I hit 30. By some miracle, or sheer willpower, I managed to do it by 26. It wasn't a mansion or anything fancy. It was a small fixer-upper on the edge of town, but it was mine. No co-signers, no loans from family, just me and the savings I'd spent years building. Closing on the house was one of the best days of my life. The sense of accomplishment was unreal, but of course the joy didn't last long. My parents, who I hadn't even told about the purchase until after it was a done deal, didn't take the news well. To say they were upset is putting it mildly. They couldn't believe I'd made such a major life decision without involving them. My mom kept repeating that I was too young to take on the responsibility of a house, while my dad muttered about how I was going to ruin myself financially. At first, I thought they were just venting and would eventually come around. But then the comments started getting weirder. About a week after I moved in, my mom referred to the house as a phase and casually mentioned how I could always come back home if things didn't work out. It felt like a slap in the face, but I brushed it off. I told myself they just needed time to adjust. It wasn't long before they started showing up unannounced. At first, it was under the guise of helping me settle in. My dad criticized the paint color in the living room, calling it immature, while my mom fussed over the kitchen cabinets, insisting they needed to be replaced immediately. They weren't offering to pay for any of this, of course. It was just their way of making me feel like I wasn't capable of managing my own home. Then came the first major red flag. One evening, I came home to find that my water had been shut off. After a long call with the utility company, I learned that someone had called to cancel service, claiming to be me. I couldn't prove who it was, but I had a sinking feeling my parents were behind it. When I casually mentioned it to them later, they played dumb, but the looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. Still, I tried to keep the peace. I didn't want to believe they'd actually sabotage me, but things only escalated from there. A few weeks later, I found out they were still tracking my location through an old family phone plan. I hadn't realized I was still on it, and when I confronted them about it, they acted offended, saying it was just in case of emergencies. That was the last straw. I disabled location sharing and started taking steps to untangle myself from any shared accounts or lingering ties. That's when things got really messy. My parents acted like I'd betrayed them. They accused me of being ungrateful and abandoning family. They'd always had a way of making me feel guilty for asserting my independence, and this was no different. Not long after, I got a notification about my mortgage payment. It said the payment was in dispute, which didn't make any sense since I hadn't made any changes to my account. When I called the bank, they told me someone had attempted to access my account and dispute the payment on my behalf. The only emergency contact listed on the account was my parents. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just meddling. They were actively trying to sabotage me. I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. Everything I'd worked so hard for was suddenly at risk, all because my parents couldn't let go of their control. Looking back, the signs were there all along, but I'd convinced myself that their behavior was just overprotectiveness. Now, I was starting to see the full picture, and it wasn't pretty. Update 1. The day after the strange notification about my mortgage dispute, I decided to dig deeper into my finances. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I started with a credit report check, which I hadn't done in a while. What I found sent me spiraling into a rabbit hole I wasn't prepared for. There was a recent inquiry tied to my mortgage account, something I hadn't authorized. I immediately called my mortgage provider. After navigating through the usual customer service maze, I finally got through to a representative. They confirmed there had been an attempt to access my account a few days prior. According to their records, someone emailed them asking to change some account details and dispute the last payment. The request didn't come from my email address, and the representative flagged it because the proof of identity provided didn't match my file. That's when the sinking realization hit: it had to be my parents. I knew my parents had access to some of my old financial information. Back when I was younger and needed their help co-signing for things like my first credit card, they kept copies of everything. I had assumed it was harmless, just part of their overly involved nature. But now, I wasn't so sure. I decided to check for myself. That evening, I stopped by their house under the pretense of visiting. While they were distracted in the kitchen, I searched through the old filing cabinet where they'd always kept important documents. Sure enough, some of my paperwork was still there: tax returns from when I was in college, student loan statements, and even some outdated account numbers. But a few key things were missing. I couldn't find the most recent copies of my mortgage paperwork or any of the closing documents for my house. My gut told me they'd taken them. I confronted them right then and there. Their reaction was exactly what I should have expected. They didn't deny it outright. Instead, they danced around the issue, claiming they were just trying to help. My mom doubled down, saying the house was a mistake and that she'd stepped in to save me from financial disaster. When I pushed for an explanation about the forged email, they changed the subject entirely and accused me of being ungrateful. Then, in a twist I didn't see coming, they suggested I sell the house and start fresh, promising they'd help me manage things better next time. I walked out before the conversation could escalate further. By then, I was shaking with frustration. I called my younger sibling to vent. They weren't surprised. Apparently, our parents had pulled similar stunts with them in the past, though not on this scale. Hearing this only fueled my determination to set boundaries. The next day at work, I told a coworker the whole story. They were horrified and immediately suggested I consult a lawyer. They also gave me some practical advice: audit all my accounts, update every password, and make sure I wasn't leaving any doors open for my parents to meddle further. The advice turned out to be a lifesaver. When I checked my accounts, I found traces of their meddling in places I hadn't even thought about. My old childhood savings account, which was still under their names, had suddenly been drained. The amount wasn't huge since I hadn't used it in years, but the principle of it stung. They'd also been keeping tabs on my activity through the family phone plan, even after I thought I'd shut off their access. That night, I changed every password, set up two-factor authentication, and updated all my contact information with the bank and utility companies. I even installed a home security system and changed the locks. If my parents were willing to go this far, I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. Their response to my actions was as predictable as it was infuriating. Within days, they called to berate me for overreacting. When I didn't respond, they left passive-aggressive voicemails, accusing me of abandoning the family and being manipulated by outside influences. When that didn't work, they escalated, threatening to cut me off completely unless I came to my senses. I didn't cave. Instead, I decided to take control of the narrative and posted my story on Reddit. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I needed advice from people who'd been through similar situations, or at least an outlet to document everything that was happening. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, I had hundreds of comments offering support, advice, and even legal resources. People encouraged me to stand my ground and reminded me that protecting my independence wasn't selfish, it was necessary. As I read through the comments, I felt more resolved than ever to keep pushing forward. My parents might have spent years trying to control my life, but this was where I drew the line. I wasn't just fighting for my house, I was fighting for my freedom. Update 2. After my first Reddit post gained traction, I realized I wasn't alone. Hundreds of people shared their stories about controlling parents and gave me advice that I never would have thought of on my own. The top suggestion: speak to a lawyer. That's exactly what I did. The following Monday, I took the morning off work and met with an attorney specializing in identity theft and financial security. I laid everything out: the attempted access to my mortgage account, the forged email, the missing documents, and even the fact that my childhood savings had mysteriously disappeared. The lawyer didn't seem shocked, which was both reassuring and disheartening. They explained that cases like mine were more common than I realized, especially when controlling parents refused to let go of their adult children. The first step was securing my mortgage account. The lawyer helped me file a formal report with my bank to block any unauthorized access and ensure no one but me could make changes. They also recommended I request an audit of all account activity over the last few months, just to see if there were any other attempts I'd missed. With those safeguards in place, we moved on to the next issue: my parents' escalating behavior. Blocking their access to my accounts only seemed to embolden them. When my parents found out I'd hired a lawyer, they were livid. I found out because they showed up at my house, again, banging on the door and shouting about how I was dragging family through the mud. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat in my living room with the blinds drawn, silently watching them through the security camera feed on my phone. Eventually, they left, but not before shoving a handwritten note under my door. The note was just as passive-aggressive as I expected, filled with accusations about me destroying the family and insisting I get help before it's too late. That night, I decided enough was enough. I blocked their numbers and all their social media accounts. It wasn't easy, but I needed to create some space. Of course, blocking them didn't stop their antics. A few days later, I found another note in my mailbox. Then another. One was taped to my front door. I started keeping a folder of these notes, knowing I'd need documentation if things got worse. Thankfully, my sibling had my back. They helped me install additional cameras around the house, covering every possible angle. They also helped me set up motion-activated lights in the front yard, which seemed to deter my parents from lingering too long. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over the situation. Then came the social media drama. A family friend who clearly had no idea what was really going on started posting vague status updates about disrespectful children and ungrateful attitudes. The timing and phrasing made it obvious they were referring to me. Mutual friends began reaching out, asking if everything was okay. I kept my responses vague, not wanting to add fuel to the fire, but it was exhausting trying to control the narrative while my parents spread their version of events. Around this time, I started seeing a therapist. The lawyer had suggested it, and honestly, it was one of the best decisions I made. The therapist helped me unpack years of manipulation and control that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. More importantly, they gave me strategies to handle the guilt my parents were so good at weaponizing. At my next meeting with the lawyer, we tackled the issue of my childhood savings account. I had assumed that account was long gone, but the lawyer explained that if my parents had taken money that legally belonged to me, I might have a case. However, when I confronted my parents about it, through a carefully worded email, they flat out refused to hand over the account, claiming it wasn't really mine. That was their justification. Since they'd opened it for me as a child, they had the right to do whatever they wanted with it. The lawyer assured me we could challenge this, but it would take time. In the meantime, my parents didn't let up. They continued showing up unannounced, leaving notes, and trying to force their way back into my life. I finally filed a police report for harassment, detailing every uninvited visit and every note they'd left. The officer I spoke with took it seriously, which was a relief. They promised to follow up if my parents crossed any legal boundaries. Of course, when my parents found out about the police report, they doubled down. Their justification: they were just protecting their son and doing what any good parents would do. It didn't matter that I was nearly 30, living on my own, and capable of making my own decisions. To them, I was still the kid they could control. Reddit was my lifeline during all of this. People encouraged me to keep documenting everything and even offered advice on how to handle the legal process. One user suggested sending a cease and desist letter to my parents, which my lawyer agreed was the next logical step. We drafted a formal letter warning them to stop all contact with me, unless they wanted to face legal consequences. It was mailed the next day. After sending the letter, I knew the situation would either escalate or start to die down. Either way, I was prepared. My parents might have spent years controlling every aspect of my life, but this time, I wasn't backing down. To keep everyone in the loop, I posted an update on Reddit detailing everything that had happened since my initial post. The support was overwhelming, and it gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. This wasn't just about standing up to my parents anymore, it was about reclaiming my independence once and for all. Update 3. The cease and desist letter was supposed to be a turning point. My lawyer had assured me it was a strong warning, one that legally required my parents to stop their harassment or face potential consequences. It was the right move, but instead of backing down, my parents saw it as a challenge. Within a week of receiving the letter, they ramped up their manipulation tactics. First, it started with emails and voicemails from extended family members. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly reached out, pleading with me to forgive my parents and be the bigger person. The messages ranged from guilt trips about family unity to outright accusations that I was overreacting. It didn't take long to figure out my parents had been calling everyone they could think of, spinning their own version of the story. I ignored the messages at first, but when they kept coming, I blocked the most persistent ones. This only led to more drama. A few family members posted vague status updates on social media about ungrateful kids these days and how family should come first. It was exhausting, but I refused to let them pull me into their narrative. During all of this, my sibling dropped a bombshell. We were catching up over coffee when they revealed something I hadn't known before. Years ago, our parents had tried a similar stunt with them. Back then, our sibling had been applying for a business loan and discovered our parents had accessed their financial records to help by offering unsolicited advice to the bank. Thankfully, they hadn't succeeded, but it explained why my sibling had distanced themselves from our parents long before I had. As if dealing with my extended family wasn't enough, I started receiving anonymous threatening texts. The messages weren't explicit, but they were unsettling. Comments about how I was making a mistake, that I'd regret this, and cryptic remarks about what goes around comes around. I suspected my parents were behind them, but there was no way to prove it. I reported the messages to the police, adding them to my growing case file. After that, I blocked every extended family member who tried to pressure me into reconciling. I had no interest in explaining myself to people who didn't understand the full story. Meanwhile, my neighbors were starting to notice my parents' behavior. They'd seen my parents sitting in their car outside my house on multiple occasions and even witnessed them leaving notes on my door. One neighbor was kind enough to give me video footage from their doorbell camera, which showed my parents lingering on the sidewalk after I refused to let them in. The final straw came when I got a notification about a credit card application I hadn't made. When I called the bank, they told me someone had attempted to open a joint credit card in my name, listing my mother as the co-applicant. I was furious but not surprised. I immediately updated my police report to include this attempted fraud. The officer handling my case assured me they were taking it seriously and would follow up if my parents crossed any more lines. Then came the Facebook post. My parents wrote a scathing public rant about how I had turned my back on family and how they were devastated by my actions. They painted themselves as the victims, claiming they were only trying to help and that I had cut them out of my life for no reason. Friends and relatives who didn't know the full story started chiming in, some expressing sympathy for them and others questioning what had really happened. I didn't engage. Instead, I took screenshots of everything and sent them to my lawyer. My therapist also encouraged me to stay firm and not get dragged into the drama. They reminded me that my parents were trying to provoke a reaction and that the best response was no response at all. A few days later, my parents left a dramatic letter on my doorstep. In it, they blamed me for breaking the family apart and accused me of being ungrateful for everything they'd done for me. It was over 3 pages long, filled with emotional manipulation and backhanded comments. I didn't even finish reading it. I handed it over to my lawyer, who added it to the growing pile of evidence. My coworkers, who'd been following the saga, were incredibly supportive. They encouraged me to keep standing up for myself and reminded me that I wasn't alone. One even offered to help me draft a letter to HR in case my parents tried to show up at my workplace. Their support made a huge difference, especially on days when the stress felt overwhelming. To keep myself grounded, I returned to Reddit and shared another update. The response was overwhelming. Again, hundreds of people chimed in with advice, validation, and stories of their own experiences with controlling parents. Knowing I wasn't alone helped me push through the emotional toll this was taking. By this point, it was clear my parents weren't going to stop unless legal action forced them to. The situation was far from over, but with every step I took to protect myself, I felt like I was regaining a little more control over my life. Update 4. After the letter incident, I knew it was time to finalize my independence. It wasn't just about cutting ties emotionally. I needed to sever every lingering connection my parents could exploit. The first step was closing every shared account. My childhood savings were tied up with them, and although my lawyer said it might take a while to resolve, I opened a new bank account and moved every cent I could access into it. I also updated all my legal documents, emergency contacts, beneficiary details, and anything else they could use to insert themselves into my life. For my home, I upgraded security again. I installed motion detectors around the property, set to trigger both lights and alerts on my phone. I added a second layer of locks to the doors and reinforced the windows. My sibling helped me test everything, and we joked about how my house was turning into a fortress. But after everything my parents had pulled, I wasn't taking chances. Just as I was starting to feel more secure, they tried a new tactic. A family friend showed up at my door uninvited, claiming they were there to mediate. They'd clearly been sent by my parents and tried to convince me to sit down and talk things out. I politely declined, but when they pressed, I shut the door and called my lawyer. The lawyer advised me to keep documenting everything, and I added the incident to my growing folder. The fallout from my parents' actions began rippling through the extended family. Some relatives reached out to say they understood my side, while others doubled down on guilt tripping. One aunt posted a long, emotional rant online about how family should always come first and people need to learn forgiveness. It was vague but unmistakably directed at me. This kicked off a mini war in the comments with family members taking sides. Watching it play out was surreal, but I stayed out of it. Meanwhile, my sibling made a big decision of their own. After hearing about the fake credit card attempt and the escalating harassment, they went no contact with our parents too. They'd already been distant for years, but this was the final straw. Knowing they were fully in my corner made a huge difference. We started talking more regularly, and they helped me navigate the mess our parents had created. Things took another bizarre turn when my parents created fake accounts to comment on my Reddit post. At first, I didn't realize it was them. The accounts left inflammatory comments, accusing me of lying, being ungrateful, and exaggerating the situation, but their tone and phrasing gave them away. These were things only my parents would say. Redditors were quick to call them out, and several users helped me identify and report the accounts. The moderators banned them within hours. That small victory felt like a turning point. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. My parents could try all the manipulation tactics they wanted, but they weren't going to win. I wasn't the scared, unsure person they used to control. With every step I took to protect myself, their power over me diminished. As things started to settle down, I reflected on how far I'd come. Setting boundaries had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most necessary. Growing up, I'd been taught that family was everything and that standing up for myself meant disrespecting them. Now I saw things differently. Respect is a two-way street, and my parents had spent years bulldozing over mine. Just when I thought they'd finally back off, they pulled one last dramatic stunt. They showed up at my workplace. I don't know how they found out where I worked, but they came in during my lunch break, demanding to see me. Thankfully, my coworkers knew about the situation and immediately alerted HR. By the time I came back, HR had already intervened and escorted my parents out of the building. They warned them to stay away or risk legal action for trespassing. That was the final straw. I filed for a restraining order the very next day. My lawyer was confident we had enough evidence to secure one. Between the notes, the uninvited visits, the fake credit card attempt, and the workplace incident, it was clear they weren't going to stop on their own. The process took a few weeks, but the restraining order was granted. My parents were legally required to stay away from me and my property. The support I received during this time was overwhelming. My coworkers, sibling, and even complete strangers on Reddit rallied around me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Every comment, message, and kind word helped me push through the emotional toll of cutting ties with my parents. With the restraining order in place, I started to focus on rebuilding my life. I returned to therapy, where I began unpacking the years of manipulation and control. I threw myself into home improvement projects, finally turning my house into a space that felt like mine. Each small change, painting a wall, fixing a broken cabinet, planting flowers in the yard, was a reminder that I was free. I shared one last update on Reddit to thank everyone for their support. The response was incredible, with thousands of people cheering me on and sharing their own stories. Knowing that my experience had resonated with so many others made the entire ordeal feel worthwhile. For the first time in my life, I felt truly independent. There was still work to do. Healing isn't an overnight process, but I was finally on the right path. Update 5. After months of turmoil, the restraining order was granted. My parents were legally required to stay away from me, my property, and my workplace. I walked out of that courtroom with a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the restraining order itself, it was the final boundary they couldn't cross without facing serious consequences. With that weight lifted, I was able to focus on the lingering legal issues. My lawyer and I had been working on regaining control of my childhood savings account, which my parents had claimed wasn't really mine. After reviewing the account's history and providing evidence of their mishandling, the bank ruled in my favor. The money wasn't much, but it was symbolic. It was one less thread tying me to their control. Meanwhile, things at work were looking up. I'd thrown myself into my projects during this time, partly to distract myself from everything happening outside the office. My efforts paid off when I received a promotion that not only boosted my salary but also solidified my financial independence. Knowing I could rely solely on myself felt like a victory in more ways than one. My sibling, who had been my rock through all of this, made their own big move, literally. They accepted a job in another state, putting even more distance between themselves and our parents. We promised to stay in touch regularly, and though I'd miss having them nearby, I was proud of them for taking this step for their own peace of mind. As for my parents, they went quiet after the restraining order. There were no more unannounced visits, no cryptic messages, no sudden outbursts on social media. For the first time in months, I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. My lawyer warned me to stay vigilant, but I allowed myself to hope that they'd finally gotten the message. Of course, that hope didn't last long. About 6 weeks after the restraining order was granted, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my parents. I didn't open it. Instead, I handed it over to my lawyer. Whatever it said wasn't going to change my decision. I had no interest in rekindling any kind of relationship with them. With the drama winding down, I began focusing on myself for the first time in years. Therapy became a regular part of my routine, and my sessions shifted from crisis management to deeper healing. I started to understand just how much their manipulation had shaped my life and how long it would take to fully undo those patterns. It was hard work, but it was worth it. I also turned my attention to my house, which had been a point of contention from the very beginning. Slowly but surely, I began making it feel like home. I repainted the walls, fixed up the backyard, and even tackled some DIY projects I'd been putting off. Every improvement, no matter how small, felt like a step forward, a way of reclaiming my space and my independence. The support I received from Reddit during all of this was nothing short of incredible. My posts had gained a lot of traction, and the final update garnered over 20,000 upvotes. Reading the comments was overwhelming in the best way. People praised my resilience, shared their own stories of breaking free from toxic relationships, and reminded me that I wasn't alone. Knowing my journey had resonated with so many strangers was a strange but comforting feeling. Extended family members still tried to guilt-trip me from time to time, but I stayed firm in my decision to go no contact. Their opinions didn't matter to me anymore. I wasn't going to sacrifice my peace of mind to keep up appearances for people who had no idea what I'd been through. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel more like myself again. I began reconnecting with old friends, strengthening my support network, and making plans for the future. I even started thinking about new goals, traveling, taking up a new hobby, maybe even starting my own business someday. For the first time in a long time, the possibilities felt endless. In my final Reddit post, I thanked the community for their unwavering support. Without their advice and encouragement, I don't know if I would have had the strength to stand up to my parents. The comments reminded me of how far I'd come and how much I'd gained by finally putting myself first. Looking ahead, I feel optimistic. My life isn't perfect, and there are still days when the past feels closer than it should. But I'm no longer defined by the control and manipulation I grew up with. I've built a life that's truly mine, and I'm excited to see where it takes me. To anyone reading this who's in a similar situation, I hope my story shows that it's possible to break free and thrive. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's worth it. Thank you for being part of my journey.